It was the annual family gathering, a moment for relatives to reconnect, catch up, and share laughter. The noise of voices filled the large, open living room, where the smell of fresh food and dessert wafted through the air. The house was abuzz, with the kind of warmth and comfort only a large family can bring. It was supposed to be a happy day, a day when the burdens of life seemed lighter, the worries momentarily forgotten. But for James, this was a moment that would shatter everything. James Monroe had worked hard his entire life, clawing his way through challenges, never asking for much but always giving everything. He had built his career from the ground up, a respected lawyer in town, someone who had worked tirelessly to give his children a future that was brighter than his own. His son, Max, had always been his pride and joy, the child who showed potential in everything he touched. James had sacrificed his own dreams to ensure that Max would have the opportunities he never did. But that afternoon, standing at the center of his family's living room, everything he had worked for began to unravel. It started as a simple conversation. One of those conversations about Max's upcoming first year of college. James had spent weeks ensuring everything was in place, making sure his son would have the best chance to succeed. He had pulled strings, used his connections, and dipped into savings he didn't even want to touch, all to make sure Max's college tuition was covered. Max had been accepted into one of the top universities in the country, and James had hoped that his son would feel a deep sense of gratitude. After all, it was James's sacrifices, his late nights, his tireless efforts, that had paved the way for Max's future. But that afternoon, as the family gathered, the light-hearted conversation about tuition turned into something far more intense. Max had always been the smart one, the one who knew how to play the game. And in that moment, as his father mentioned, the final payment he had made for the first year of college, something inside Max seemed to snap. Without warning, Max's voice cut through the room, louder than it had ever been before. "You think that paying for my college tuition makes you special, Dad?" Max had said, his tone sharp, almost venomous. "You think you're the only one who's been working hard? I'm the one going to college, not you. It's my future, not yours." James stood frozen, the words like a slap to his face. The room grew unnervingly quiet. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. His family members, who had been laughing just moments earlier, were now staring at him, their eyes wide with disbelief. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, the sting of humiliation. What stung even more was that Max didn't care who was watching. The venom in his son's words wasn't just for James. It was a public display of disrespect, something he'd never expected from the child he had sacrificed everything for. James had tried to maintain composure, tried to remind himself that this was just a phase, that his son was under pressure, but the sting of it was far too deep. His mind raced as the conversation spiraled out of control. The humiliation, the hurt, the betrayal, it all overwhelmed him in that moment. Was this really the child he had raised? Was this the same boy who used to look up to him with admiration, who would run to him with every problem and expect answers? Max, on the other hand, had no intention of backing down. His eyes were cold, almost indifferent. There was no trace of the love or admiration he once had for his father. Instead, there was an arrogance, a sense of entitlement that James had never seen before. "You act like you've done something extraordinary," Max continued, his voice loud and challenging. "But this is what you're supposed to do. You're my parent. You don't get a medal for doing what you're supposed to do." James tried to gather his thoughts, but nothing seemed to work. His mind, his heart, were in turmoil. He'd worked so hard, given everything to provide for this boy. And now, in front of everyone, his friends, his family, the people who had known them for years, his son had publicly humiliated him. James was no longer the respected father figure. He was the subject of ridicule. What hurt the most wasn't the words themselves. It wasn't even the disrespect. It was the realization that Max didn't understand. He didn't understand the sacrifices James had made, the countless hours spent working late, the dreams James had put on hold to ensure his son's success. Max didn't see the love behind the sacrifices, only the money, only the resources James had provided. And now, in front of everyone, he had made it clear that he didn't care. The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. The family was silent. No one knew how to react. Some looked at James with sympathy, others at Max with disbelief. No one had expected this. James was the pillar of strength in the family, the one everyone looked up to. But in this moment, Max had torn that image to shreds. It was more than just the humiliation. It was the betrayal of everything James had worked for. His pride, his legacy, his role as a father. It all felt like it had been stripped away in an instant. Max's words echoed in James's mind long after the incident. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Their relationship, once unshakable, was now fractured. The boy he had raised, the boy he had loved and cared for, had just shown him the coldness of adulthood. And for the first time in his life, James felt truly alone. The silence that followed Max's outburst was deafening. James stood there, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and disbelief. The weight of what had just transpired crashed over him, and he could feel his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat. The laughter from before had vanished entirely, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness that seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been put out. Max's words played over and over in James's mind, each repetition making it harder to breathe. You think you're special, Dad? You think you deserve a medal for doing what you're supposed to do? They were simple words, but the sting they carried was undeniable, like a razor cutting through the very foundation of their relationship. James had spent years building up a life for Max, sacrificing his own personal comforts and desires to give him everything he needed. Everything he thought was the key to a better life for his son. He had never asked for anything in return, not even gratitude. All he wanted was for Max to understand that his father had always had his back, no matter what. But this was something he never could have prepared for. Max, however, seemed unaffected by the aftermath. After the outburst, he had walked away without a second glance, disappearing upstairs to his room like nothing had happened. His behavior was nothing short of defiant, and James couldn't understand how his son had become someone so foreign to him. For the first time, he saw a side of Max he didn't recognize, a side that wasn't just rebellious, but entitled, dismissive, and cold. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure of how to react. Some had glanced at James with apologetic expressions, while others seemed to avoid eye contact altogether. No one wanted to get involved, and James didn't blame them. They were caught in a situation that was beyond their control. But what about Max? What about his own son? The family gathering had completely lost its warmth, leaving behind nothing but fractured silence and an air of tension that James couldn't shake. He had hoped to be able to discuss the situation calmly, to explain to Max how much he had given up for him, but his son's dismissive behavior had rendered such a conversation impossible. James found himself standing at the window, staring out at the evening sky, feeling the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. He didn't know what had happened to his son. This wasn't the Max he had raised, the boy who had been so grateful, so eager to please. Max had been an intelligent and driven young man, but now all James could see was someone who took everything for granted. He thought about his own father, how they had never been close, how there had always been a distance between them that James had sworn he wouldn't repeat with his own son. He had been determined to break the cycle, to be the kind of father who was present, who gave his child everything he had. But now, standing here alone, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been for nothing. The humiliation he felt was compounded by the feeling of betrayal. He had put so much faith into Max, believing that his sacrifices would lead to a better future for both of them. Now it seemed that Max only saw those sacrifices as obligations, nothing special, nothing worth appreciating. As the evening wore on, the family began to trickle out, the tension lingering long after the last guest had left. James was left alone, in the quiet house, still processing everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed permanently in his relationship with Max. He couldn't just let it go. The words were too sharp, too cutting. The next few days were filled with a heavy silence between father and son. James tried to reach out to Max, attempting to engage in casual conversation, but Max remained distant and cold. Every time James brought up the incident, Max would brush it off, pretending as though nothing had happened. The arrogance and dismissiveness in his son's attitude were maddening. It was as though he was trying to erase the hurt, as though nothing needed to be addressed. James felt helpless. The more he tried to get through to Max, the more he realized how deep the rift had become. His son was no longer the boy he knew. Instead, he was someone else, a stranger who didn't value the things that had once mattered to him. And that was perhaps the hardest part to bear, the realization that his efforts to be a good father, his sacrifices, had meant nothing to Max. One evening, after a long, silent dinner, James sat at the kitchen table, staring at his son across from him. Max was on his phone, scrolling through something that clearly wasn't important. It was a habit he had picked up in recent months, detaching from everything around him, focusing only on his own world. James couldn't understand it. He wanted to scream, to demand that Max acknowledge what he had done, but he knew it would do no good. Instead, James reached into his wallet and pulled out the envelope containing the receipts for Max's tuition. Payment. It wasn't much, just a few papers showing that he had indeed paid for the first year of college. But in that moment, it felt like everything. This was the money that had gone into Max's education. This was the money that James had sacrificed his own comfort to secure, and Max had disrespected him, had mocked him, as if none of it mattered. James placed the envelope on the table between them, staring at it as if it held the answers he was searching for. Max didn't even look up from his phone, his indifference cutting through the air like a blade. James knew what he had to do. He had always been there for Max, always given him everything. But now, it was time for Max to understand the consequences of his actions, to understand that his father wasn't someone to be dismissed, not anymore. James took a deep breath and stood up. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he was. Done being disrespected, done being treated like a mere provider. If Max was going to act like this, then perhaps it was time for him to truly see the price of his arrogance. James stood in the kitchen, the envelope containing Max's first-year tuition payment resting heavily on the table. He had expected his son to react, to notice the gesture, but Max remained absorbed in his phone, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. James's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He had never felt so distant from his own child. It was as though a vast canyon had opened up between them, a divide that he wasn't sure how to cross. The silence between them was suffocating. James had always prided himself on being a patient man, someone who understood the importance of time, of allowing people to process their emotions. But now, with Max's disrespect echoing in his mind, patience felt like weakness. He couldn't let this slide. Not this time. Max had crossed a line, and James knew that it was his responsibility to make sure his son understood the weight of his actions. He took a slow, steady breath and walked over to Max. The soft click of his footsteps on the hardwood floor seemed to amplify in the stillness of the room. As he reached Max, he placed his hand firmly on the back of the chair, his voice low but steady. "Max," James began, trying to keep his emotions in check. "We need to talk." Max didn't look up. His fingers moved swiftly across the phone screen, tapping away at something that clearly held his attention. James's jaw clenched, frustration rising within him, but he knew this couldn't be handled with anger. He needed to get through to his son. "Max," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. "Look at me." Finally, after a long pause, Max's gaze shifted from the phone to his father. His expression was blank, disinterested, almost as if this conversation didn't matter to him at all. James could feel the walls that Max had built up around himself, walls that were impenetrable, suffocating any attempt to reach the son he once knew. "You think paying for your college tuition makes me special, don't you?" James began, his voice calm but laced with an underlying tension. "You think it's just something that's supposed to happen? That I'm just supposed to pay for it without question?" Max rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Dad, I don't want to talk about this right now. I've got stuff to do." James's heart clenched at the dismissal. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the casual way Max dismissed everything James had worked for. "You don't get to run away from this," James said, his voice quiet but steady. "You don't get to just pretend that what I've done for you doesn't matter." Max's eyes flickered with impatience, but there was something else there too, a hint of guilt that James knew wasn't easy for him to admit. "I didn't ask you to pay for my college, Dad," Max muttered, his voice tinged with resentment. "I never asked you to do any of this. You just think you're supposed to do it." James felt the anger bubble up inside him, but he held it back. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when he would have to confront the truth. "You're right," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't ask for your approval when I worked to put you through college, but I did it because I wanted to give you the opportunity to have a better life than I did, and I did it because I love you." Max's expression softened, but only slightly. There was still that barrier between them, that wall of entitlement and disregard that James didn't know how to break down. "You didn't have to do all that," Max said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "I would have figured it out. I don't need you to always be there, always making decisions for me." James inhaled sharply, the sting of Max's words cutting deeper than he had expected. It wasn't the first time Max had acted this way, but it was the first time that James truly understood how deep the disconnect between them had grown. It was more than just the college tuition. It was everything. The sacrifices James had made, the late nights spent working, the missed moments with his family. Max had never seen any of it, never understood the weight of his father's choices. "Maybe you wouldn't have had to figure it out if I hadn't worked my ass off to make sure you didn't have to," James replied, his voice shaking with frustration. "Maybe you wouldn't have had the chance to go to college at all if I hadn't put everything on the line for you. You think this is just about money? It's not. It's about love. It's about giving you what I never had so you could have a chance at something better." Max's face twitched, the first sign of real emotion breaking through his defensive exterior. But it was brief. "I didn't ask for your pity, Dad. I didn't ask for you to sacrifice your life for me." James felt the words like a slap. Your pity. That was how Max saw it? All the work, the effort, the sweat, just pity? The pain was too much to bear, but he refused to show it. He couldn't. "I don't need your thanks, Max," James said, the words coming out more harshly than he intended. "I never needed you to thank me. But what I do need, what I've always needed, is for you to understand what I've done for you. Understand what it costs to give someone a future. And if you can't see that, if you can't recognize that, then maybe you need to rethink who you're looking at when you look at me." Max stood up from the chair, clearly done with the conversation. "I don't want to hear this," he muttered, walking toward the door. "I'm going to my room." "But," James wasn't finished. "No, you're not leaving until we're done here," he said, his voice firm. Max froze, tension radiating from his body. James could see that the walls were beginning to crack, but he wasn't sure if it was out of guilt or defiance. "This is the part where you finally realize that I'm not just the guy who gives you money," James continued, his voice low but intense. "I'm your father, and whether you like it or not, I have done everything for you because I love you, and now it's time for you to realize what that means." Max turned slowly, his face contorting with a mixture of frustration and something else. Something deeper. Something James wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But in that moment he knew that his son heard him, not in the way he had hoped, not with the understanding he had longed for, but in a way that was irreversible. Max couldn't walk away from this conversation anymore. The weight of James's words, of his actions, would follow him, and James would make sure that Max understood the cost of the disrespect he had shown. The days after their conversation were no easier. The atmosphere in the house was thick with tension, the weight of unresolved emotions pressing down on both father and son. James had hoped that Max would come to his senses, that the words he had spoken would resonate with his son. But nothing had changed. Max continued to retreat into himself, his once close bond with his father now feeling like a distant memory. James had spent the last few days grappling with the aftermath. He had tried to reach out to make amends, but every attempt was met with a wall of silence. Max would barely look at him, let alone talk to him. It was as though the son he had known for so many years had disappeared, replaced by someone who was unrecognizable. But James knew one thing: he couldn't let this go. He couldn't allow Max to continue down this path of entitlement and disrespect. Max needed to understand the gravity of his actions, and James was determined to make sure of it. One evening, after Max had returned from his summer job, an odd attempt at independence, James thought. James sat in the living room, waiting. He had made up his mind. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation. It was going to be a confrontation. If Max wasn't going to come to him, James would go to Max. As the front door opened and Max stepped inside, James stood up from the couch, his posture rigid. Max looked at him briefly, his eyes avoiding his father's gaze, and began to walk toward the stairs, clearly eager to escape the tension. "Max, stop!" James called out, his voice firm, almost commanding. Max froze mid-step, his body stiffening as he turned slowly to face his father. There was a flicker of something, fear maybe, or guilt, before Max masked it with indifference. "What now, Dad?" he asked, his tone laced with annoyance. James took a deep breath, gathering his resolve. He could feel the weight of the moment, the years of sacrifice, love, and disappointment hanging in the balance. This was it. He couldn't let his son slip away, not like this. He couldn't let Max walk through life thinking that disrespect was acceptable. "I need you to sit down," James said, his voice calm but unwavering. Max hesitated for a long moment, looking at his father as though weighing the situation. There was no escape for him, not tonight. With a sigh, he made his way to the couch, slouching into the seat like a child who was being forced to endure a lecture. But James wasn't going to lecture him. This wasn't about talking at Max. This was about making him listen. "I've been thinking about our conversation," James began, his voice quiet at first, almost reflective. "And I want to say something that you need to hear." Max didn't respond, but James could see that he was listening, albeit unwillingly. The way his eyes were fixed on the floor, the way he shifted in his seat, it was clear that Max was bracing himself, waiting for the usual tirade. But James wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to beg for his son's respect. He was going to show him the truth. "I'm not angry with you, Max," James continued, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm hurt. You think everything I've done for you is just because it's my job, my duty as a parent. But it's more than that. It's love, Max. It's love that's been buried in every late night, every moment I missed with you, every sacrifice I made to give you a life that was better than mine." Max shifted in his seat, the discomfort clear on his face. But he still refused to meet his father's gaze. James wasn't going to let that stop him. "You think I don't know what you're feeling?" James asked, his voice breaking slightly, the pain creeping into his words. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't need anyone, to feel like you can do it all on your own. But let me tell you something, Max. There's no shame in accepting help. There's no shame in acknowledging that your parents sacrificed everything for you. You have no idea what it costs, what it takes to give you a future. I've given up so much of myself to make sure you could have a chance at something better. And this is how you repay me? With disrespect?" Max's eyes flickered to his father, but he still wouldn't speak. The defiance was there, but it was weaker now, like a child who had been scolded but didn't quite understand why. James took another breath, his chest tight with emotion. "When you said those things to me, when you told me I was just doing what I'm supposed to do, that hurt more than anything. Because it wasn't just about the money, Max. It was about the fact that you don't understand the cost. You don't see what I've done for you because you're too busy thinking you deserve it." Max's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. It was like the words had finally pierced through his armor, but he still wasn't ready to admit it, to take responsibility. James could feel the distance between them, but there was something else now, a flicker of recognition, maybe even shame in Max's eyes. "You think you're entitled to everything because you're my son," James said softly, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet power. "But Max, respect isn't something you're entitled to. It's earned, and I've spent my whole life trying to earn your respect. But what you did, what you said to me, that didn't earn anything. It took away everything." Max's face changed. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by something closer to guilt. For the first time in days, he spoke. His voice was low, almost inaudible. "I didn't mean it, Dad. I'm sorry." James paused, staring at his son. The apology was small, fleeting, but it was enough. He could see it in Max's eyes, the regret, the confusion, the realization that he had crossed a line. Wasn't an easy thing for a son to admit, especially not after everything that had transpired. But it was a start. "I know you didn't mean it," James said, his voice softer now. "But words matter, Max. They matter more than you think, and I need you to understand that." Max looked up, his eyes searching his father's face. "I do. I get it now. I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean to hurt you." James nodded slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "I don't expect you to always agree with me, Max, but I do expect you to respect me, because I've given you everything I have, and I will always have your back, but only if you understand what that means." Max sat silently for a moment, processing his father's words. He still didn't fully understand everything, but James could see that the walls had come down, even if just a little. It was a step forward, a small one, but a step. "I'll do better, Dad," Max said finally, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. "I promise." James felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would require patience, understanding, and growth on both sides. But for the first time in a long time, James felt hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The days following that difficult conversation were filled with quiet, cautious steps toward healing. The tension that had once ruled the house had begun to dissipate, but the emotional weight was still there, lingering in the corners of every room. It was as though a crack had been made in the wall between James and Max, but neither of them knew yet how deep or permanent the break would be. Max still seemed distant, reluctant to confront the weight of his actions fully, but at least the raw, open hostility had softened. The apology was a start. It wasn't everything, but it was something. James had always been the kind of man who believed in action over words. He didn't expect Max's apology to erase the damage done, but he did expect it to spark a shift. Sometimes the lessons didn't come from confrontation or speeches. They came from silence. And in the days after their conversation, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them that something had to change. Max had spent more time in his room, retreating into his world of college applications, social media, and the daily routines of a young man on the edge of adulthood. James, too, had retreated into himself, thinking deeply about how his relationship with his son had become so fractured. He had always assumed that love was enough, that the sacrifices he had made would be seen for what they were, understood for their worth. But the truth was more complex than that. Max was no longer the boy who looked up to him for guidance. He was a young adult, full of his own ideas, full of his own arrogance. And James had failed to recognize that shift. He had failed to see Max as someone who needed his own space, his own voice in their relationship. It wasn't until a week later that James truly understood that the road to healing was not going to be a simple one. It wasn't just about the apology or the confrontation. It was about a recalibration of their relationship. They had been so focused on the tangible sacrifices, the money, the tuition, the effort, that they had overlooked the emotional aspect of their bond. The unspoken truth was that Max had to feel seen, heard and respected in a way that James had never fully understood. And perhaps more than anything, James had to acknowledge that his son was growing up, and with that came a new dynamic in their relationship. One night, after a particularly tense dinner where both father and son had avoided eye contact, Max finally broke the silence. It was subtle at first, a small gesture, but it was enough. Max had asked James about his day, something he hadn't done in weeks. It wasn't much, but it was a bridge. James looked up from his plate, surprised by the question. He paused for a moment, not sure how to respond. He wasn't used to these small gestures from Max. He had always been the one to initiate conversation, to lead the way. But this time, it was different. And James realized, in that moment, that this was how the healing would begin, not through grand speeches or acts of defiance, but through these small, seemingly insignificant moments of reconnection. "It was fine," James said, a small smile, tugging at his lips. "Busy but good. How about you?" Max hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The question hung in the air between them for a moment before he answered, his voice quieter than usual. "Same. Just school stuff. You know, college apps." James nodded, keeping the conversation simple. He didn't want to push Max too hard, not yet. But he could feel something shifting. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in Max's demeanor. He was opening up, in his own way, at his own pace. The next day, Max came downstairs for breakfast and offered to help James with the groceries. It was a simple offer, but it struck James more than it should have. It wasn't the act itself. It was the gesture. It was Max's way of showing that he was willing to engage again, willing to acknowledge his father without the barriers that had been so firmly in place before. James didn't push him, didn't try to force a conversation. Instead, he simply nodded and accepted the help, silently grateful for the small step forward. That evening, Max asked James about something he had never shown much interest in before: James's work, his career, the cases he had been working on. It wasn't a deep dive into the emotional turmoil James had been feeling, but it was a crack in the armor, a sign that Max was beginning to see his father as more than just the guy who paid for everything. James felt a sense of pride in the conversation, but more importantly, he felt a sense of connection that had been missing for so long. Max had always been the son who was driven, the one with the most potential, the one who seemed destined for great things. But the harsh truth that James was beginning to accept was that Max needed to carve out his own path. He needed to learn from his mistakes, but he also needed the space to grow and make those mistakes on his own. James could guide him, could support him, but he couldn't force him to understand everything all at once. And that was the hardest part. James had spent so many years trying to provide the perfect life for Max, trying to shape him into the person he thought he should be. But in doing so, he had neglected the fact that Max was his own person, one who needed to find his own way, in his own time. James couldn't always protect him from the hard lessons of life, and he certainly couldn't shield him from the consequences of his actions. But what he could do was offer him the opportunity to learn. He could give Max the freedom to grow, to make mistakes, and to find his way back to the love and respect that had always been there. As the weeks passed, Max's attitude continued to shift. He began to show more gratitude for the things James had done for him, though it was still a work in progress. The emotional distance between them didn't vanish overnight, but it started to shrink. And James, too, began to realize that he had to let go of the need for instant resolution. Healing wasn't a quick fix. It was a slow process, one that took time and patience. But it was worth it. Every moment of growth, every step toward understanding, was worth the struggle. One evening, about a month after the conversation that had changed everything, Max came into the living room where James was sitting and handed him a letter. It was addressed to James, with no return address. James opened it slowly, unsure of what to expect. Inside, there was a simple message. "Dad, I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't understand then, but I think I'm starting to. Thanks for everything. I love you, Max." James smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything he needed. The healing was still a work in progress, but it was happening. And for the first time in a long while, James felt like he had his son back. A few months passed since Max had handed James that letter, a simple yet profound gesture that had opened up a new chapter in their relationship. The healing wasn't complete, but it was real. Both father and son had learned valuable lessons about each other, lessons that could only be learned through the cracks in their bond, through the pain and the misunderstandings. They had reached a point of understanding that James had once thought impossible. Max was still not the perfect son. He still had his moments of arrogance, his missteps, and his growing pains as a young adult, trying to carve out his place in the world. But now there was a new level of mutual respect between them. Max was no longer the child who took everything for granted, and James had learned that sometimes the most profound lessons come not from the sacrifices you make, but from the space you give the people you love to figure things out for themselves. The tension between them had melted into something more, akin to the relationship they had once shared, a mix of trust, love, and mutual understanding. Their bond was no longer rooted in what James could give Max, but in who they were to each other, beyond the titles of father and son. The emotional distance that had once existed between them had shrunk, replaced by a new sense of connection, one that was harder earned but far more genuine. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, James couldn't help but notice how much quieter things had become. The tension had settled into a comfortable silence, one that didn't feel oppressive. Max was talking more about his college applications, sharing his hopes, his worries, and his dreams. It was a conversation that James had longed to have but never thought would come. Max had finally opened up about the struggles he was facing, the fear of the unknown, and the pressure to live up to expectations. James listened, not with the urgency of a parent trying to fix everything, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "I don't know if I'll even get in," Max said, his voice slightly strained. "There are a lot of people who are way smarter than me, and I don't want to let you down, Dad. I know how much you've invested in me. I don't want to waste that." James paused, the weight of those words settling in. He had spent years trying to ensure that Max would never feel this kind of pressure, but here it was. Max's own internal struggle, his own fear of failure. James knew this wasn't just about college applications. This was about Max growing, coming to terms with the fact that no one could live up to everyone's expectations, especially not the impossible ones we set for ourselves. "Max," James said softly, setting down his fork, "you're not going to let me down. You never have. I've always been proud of you, not because of your grades or your success, but because of who you are. And I'm proud of you for trying, for going after what you want. That's all I've ever wanted for you." Max looked up at his father, his eyes searching for the sincerity in his words. James could see that Max was still uncertain, still grappling with the pressure he had placed on himself. But there was a shift in his posture, a slight relaxation as he heard the truth in his father's voice. "I'm trying, Dad," Max whispered. "I just don't know if it's enough." James leaned forward, his expression softening. "You've always been enough, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what. Whether you get into college or whether you decide to go a different route, what matters is that you're trying. That's what counts." For the first time in a long while, Max smiled, genuinely, without the guardedness that had become so familiar between them. It wasn't a smile of victory or triumph. It was a smile of acceptance, of realizing that his father's love wasn't conditional on success. That was something Max had never fully understood before. He had always thought that love and approval had to be earned, that they came with conditions. But now, sitting there, hearing his father speak from the heart, he realized that love could simply be given. It didn't have to be earned through achievements or accolades. As the weeks went by, Max's attitude continued to improve. He became more open, more willing to share his thoughts and fears with his father. They still had their disagreements, still had moments of tension, but they were no longer rooted in a lack of understanding. Instead, they were moments of growth, moments that allowed both of them to learn something new about each other. One evening, after Max had received his first college acceptance letter, he sat down beside James on the couch, holding the letter in his hands. His eyes were wide with excitement, but there was something else there too, a sense of gratitude that had been absent for so long. "I got in, Dad," Max said, his voice filled with disbelief. "I actually got in." James smiled, pride filling his chest. He knew this moment was about more than just the letter. It was about Max's journey, about everything they had gone through together to get here. "That's amazing, Max," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard for this." Max nodded, his eyes welling with tears as the weight of everything he had worked for, and everything his father had done for him, finally seemed to sink in. "I couldn't have done it without you," Max said quietly. "I get it now, Dad. Everything you've done. I see it. I see you." James felt a lump form in his throat, but he smiled anyway, proud of how far they had come. It wasn't just the acceptance letter, it was the understanding, the deep bond they had finally built. The healing was complete, not because of what they had gone through, but because of how they had chosen to grow through it. For the first time in a long time, James didn't feel the need to explain himself or justify his actions. Max didn't expect anything more from him. They both understood each other now, in a way that was deeper than before. "I'll always be here for you, Max," James said softly, his voice full of warmth. "No matter what. Always." Max nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. They didn't need any more words. They had reached the place where words weren't necessary. They understood each other, and that was all that mattered. And as Max held the acceptance letter in his hands, ready to take the next step toward his future, James knew that their relationship had transformed into something stronger, more enduring. It was no longer just about what he had given Max. It was about the unspoken bond that had grown between them, one built on respect, understanding, and unconditional love.